So here we've been talking about for the last lesson how America is going to find itself involved in World War One or World War II, I should say. And remember, we're asking this question about whether or not World War II could have been prevented, and that question about whether or not World War II itself is something that's preventable, I think is important to look at here with this lesson for a couple of reasons. Ultimately, I think we have to take a look at this in terms of just being maybe America might have been able to somehow prevent World War II, but we're isolationist, and we're going to explore that here on this first slide. And getting involved in this war, we're going to see actually is going to be against the law. Like, Americans aren't even going to be allowed to technically get involved in this war, let alone actually prevent some other sort of kind of magical World War II from happening. As we go, we're going to see that America's going to kind of stumble here because really it's responding to injustice. And why did some people not respond to it while others do? And America's really going to look at this world in the 1920s and the 1930s and say, this is not our problem, right? Whatever happens over there in Europe or in Africa down over there or Asia on that side of the world, that's not our problem. Americans are really upset about being manipulated the way we were during World War I, and we'll see that really is going to play a good bit here for Americans in terms of why it is that we don't want to go to war. So let's take a look here at what it is that's keeping us from going to war. And really, one of the things that maybe some people will argue actually keeps America, or I should say rather, helps promote the existence of World War II because we don't get involved. So let's start with this concept that we are really disgusted with the world at this point in time. Let's not forget that America had suffered all kinds of casualties in World War I, 300,000 of them, that we have seen dictators rise up all over the place, whether that's going to be Hitler in Germany, whether it's going to be Mussolini in Italy, whether it's going to be Tojo in Japan, or Stalin in the Soviet Union. And we send hundreds of thousands of Americans overseas to do what? To die so that these dictators could take over? So we're really disillusioned. Let's not forget, too, that we loaned a ton of money to these countries for them to fight in World War I, and now we see these dictators rise up. So it's really going to be something that that it's going to stick in our craw, that's really going to, as we see, keep us really kind of isolationist during the 1920s and the 1930s. So by the 1920s, as America is kind of really shutting itself off from immigrants, remember nativism, stopping those immigrants from coming into the United States, at the same time, we're not going to want to get involved in the other affairs of the world. We want to remain apart from those political affairs of the rest of the world, especially when we see those World War I countries that we had attempted to help not pay off their loans, in part due to the Great Worldwide Depression that we're all experiencing in the 1930s, but that doesn't necessarily matter, right? You made an obligation, Europe, Germany, France, Britain, you made an obligation, you promised to pay back those loans, and now you're not. And then we discover in the early 1920s through something called the Nye Committee that companies in America that made and sold these weapons, banks that had loaned this money over to these nations in Europe, they made incredible and ridiculous profit on the lives of Americans. But they made outrageous war profits, while the average American was suffering, dying in World War I. So you have an America that really just does not want to be involved in the rest of the world. We have our own problems, and while the rest of the world is dealing with theirs, they're really kind of shortchanging us. So Congress is going to pass 3 different neutrality acts. And that's what I meant when I say, could World War II have been prevented? No, because it was against the law. And you can see that right where my little lightsabers are. These 3 different neutrality acts prevent us from trading with nations that are at war. By 1937, we can't trade with any nation that is at war. And that's a lot of nations. I put here, just for funsies, a list of nations that were involved in war in the 1920s and the 1930s. That's a really big list of nations involved in war, isn't it? I mean, take a look at that. From everyone from France and Great Britain down to Nicaragua and Kuwait and Chile and Tibet. But the point I'm trying to show you here is that so much of the world is in turmoil in the 1920s and 30s, and America, we don't want anything to do with it. So that by 1937, it's illegal for us to trade with any of the nations on this list because they're involved with war. It's a really big mess. And this isn't even World War II. These nations that I'm talking about here, that are this list right there, that's not even World War II. That hasn't even started yet for many of the nations that are out there. World War II for many of these countries doesn't start until 1939. The only exception to that list that we're going to see here is going to be China, for whom World War II starts significantly earlier. But all the same, we just don't want to get involved. It's just not something that we see as valuable to us, and why we don't want to get involved. So you can understand then, as you look at this list here, why do some people respond to injustice and others don't? Because it's not our problem. We were manipulated once before in World War I. We don't want to be manipulated again. As a result, we make sure that America can't get involved in these different countries that are involved in war, because we don't want to have it happen to us again.